We're filming today for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive in San Diego, California. Pleased to have as my guest jazz pianist Mike Wofford.
Pleased to be here.
It's nice to be in San Diego coming from the winter of Northeast, you know.
It's a little wetter here this year than typically, but it's still nice.
Yeah, we're not going to go home with a tan this time, I
No,
don't think.
not this time, I'm afraid.
What's San Diego's music atmosphere like down here? Is it, can you play here a lot, or do you have to travel elsewhere?
Well, I think it's like most cities its size across the country. The jazz scene is perilous at best, and from one year to the next, it'll be better than others. Right now, it's not great. We've lost a couple of what were the major clubs here. There's always activity, and there are wonderful players here, great players working, but I wouldn't call it a thriving jazz scene right now. But again, I think that's true in most cities I've been in from one year to the next. It varies. Next year may be a complete turnaround, who knows. But right now, it's not as good as it had been a couple of years ago. So, but it's a very vibrant town musically. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, a lot of interesting music experimentation, and some wonderful, wonderful players, and a lot of really wonderful young players. The UCSD music department here, the University of California in La Jolla, has a wonderful music department where jazz and experimental music are concerned, and also out at San Diego State University. So they help, you know.
Yeah. Is there a stronger influence, being that you're so close to Mexico, in the Latin end of things?
Well, it's interesting. There is now, but that would not have been the case even up until just a few years ago. Typically, I would say no, that would not have been the case years ago here. I mean, you would draw that conclusion. It seems like an obvious connection, but it's only been recently that that has really occurred. But now, yeah, it's very strong. There's more Latin-oriented music of one type or another, whether it's Brazilian or Afro-Cuban, whatever, and blues generally active in the city right now than traditional jazz or acoustic jazz, you know. There's, like everywhere, there's a certain amount of contemporary jazz, or whatever term you want to use, that sometimes is borderline jazz at best, and, you know, we have our share of that. Some of it's fine and some of it's not so fine, but anyway, if that answers your question.
Yeah. I like that term you just said, borderline jazz. Maybe that should be the name in the record bands. You know, instead of new age, instead of fusion, we'll call it borderline.
Well, you know, I don't just categorically. A lot of people my age and my generation do just categorically rule out a lot of types of musical trends. I've tried to stay away from that over the years. I guess I have a pretty eclectic tastes. I love a lot of different kinds of music and a lot of different genre, if it's honest, if it's real. And I think most of us know when it's real pretty quickly, and we know when it's not. And in the, whatever you want to call it, of course, in the 70s, when it first started coming to the forefront, we called it fusion or jazz rock. You know, those were kind of primitive early terms. And now I think in different parts of the country it even has different terms, whether it's pop jazz, contemporary jazz, light jazz, whatever. But I think there's good and bad. I've heard some people that are marvelous in that area. I love the Yellow Jackets, for instance. But a lot of it I call jazz for people who don't like jazz. You know.
Right.
And of course Joe Zawinul has done wonderful things over the years, you know. So you can't just paint with a wide brush and rule out. But a lot of it is false advertising, as far as I'm concerned. You know.
Trying to jump on some bandwagon, perhaps, although I don't know how big the wagon is.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I talk to people in that field, and there's they complain about the same things others do as far
Yeah.
as the work. It's not as if they're finding a whole lot of outlets either. I mean,
Right.
it's a, you know, the club situation in the United States is not great for any kind of music.
No.
Worse than it's ever been, I think. And you know, there are certain sociological reasons for that and economic
Yeah.
considerations. But it's not great. I think jazz, you know, the real thing, whatever that means to you, I think we all pretty much understand is if it's to survive, it has to be, it has to find other venues. It's not, the nightclub is a thing of the past, I think, for the
Yeah.
most part. There'll always be a certain amount going on in major areas like New York and Los Angeles, and to a certain extent San Francisco, although San Francisco has the same problems we do here, I think.
Do you think putting jazz in the concert hall has been a good thing for the music?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here again, I disagree with a lot of my peers who think that it's the ideal environment, the concert hall, I mean. People are quiet, no cash register noise, no peripheral distractions.
Uh-huh.
But those are the very things that I grew up with, and to me, some of the best music happens in those very environments, in clubs where it may be noisy, people talking and laughing, and noise going on behind the bar, and sometimes the most creative moments happen in those environs. And a concert hall can be deadly,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Not always, but I mean it can be. You know, we've all experienced that. So, you know, ideally, I'd love to see it all coexist. I'd love to see a healthy nightclub scene
Yeah.
and concert outlets for at least for a certain amount of activity. But I think it's going to have to be more and more concerts, and the universities help there a lot, I think, and it's certainly not happening on TV. We know that,
Right.
And anyway, yeah, it's. But I have real mixed emotions. I don't always think those absolutely quiet, attentive situations are the most conducive to great jazz playing sometimes.
There's not as much interaction between the audience. It's hard for the musicians to get feedback or energy from an
I think
audience
so.
that's kind of out there beyond the footlights, I think.
Not everyone agrees, but I
Uh-huh.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying.
Well, you said the nightclub scene is what you were familiar with when you were growing up, and you were born in San Antonio, is that
Mhm.
right? Did you stay there a long time?
No, we really lived in Dallas,
Uh-huh.
my family, but we happened to, my father did a lot of traveling in his work, and we were in San Antonio at that particular time for a
Oh.
brief time, I think just a few months.
Oh,
But I really, really Dallas was where we lived. But then when I was about 5 or 6, we came out here to San Diego, which was during
Oh.
the war, the Second World War at that time. And so I really am almost a native, not quite, but
I see.
I grew up here. And then I went up, moved to LA in the early 60s and lived up there for almost 20 years. And then moved back to San Diego.
so you've never done the New York thing?
No, I've spent a lot of time in New York. I've never actually resided there. I've
Yeah.
been there for weeks at a time on
Yeah.
different recording projects or playing. I've always regretted that, and I always advise young players, if they're really serious about doing something, sooner or later they have to deal with New York. They have to take that step and do
Uh-huh.
it. And that discourages a lot of them right there. But I firmly believe that New York is the proving ground where ultimately you have to be able to hold your own. To get, if you're looking for the kind of recognition and opportunities that are going to help build a career. Now
Uh-huh.
you can play the music for the sheer satisfaction of playing the music, and even maybe make some kind of a living at it if you can also do other things as well, you know, play shows and do accompanying, which I've done quite a bit of over the years. You can do all of those things anywhere, virtually, you know, if it's an area of any size. But if you're serious about carving a place for yourself in you know, the scheme of things, it has to be done in New York City, and it doesn't happen in Los Angeles, and it doesn't happen. Now, people can, once they've arrived in New York, can go anywhere and carry that cachet with them, you know. I mean, I know great New York players who now live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or wherever, but they will always be thought of as New York players. It doesn't matter, you know. But if you haven't made that step there, then it's very difficult. There are so many wonderful players on the West Coast who just languished out here because there isn't the press out here, there isn't the springboard to Europe. Just geographically, you're at a disadvantage being on the West Coast. There's Asia, obviously, but still, it's really the proximity to Europe and the ability to travel over there, more so now than ever. I mean, it's really true today that I think many musicians depend on Europe for a big part of their employment each year, you know, and for outlets for playing. So anyway, yeah, that's... But a lot of great players came from the West, went to New York, changed the music in New York, and are always thought of as New Yorkers, like Dexter Gordon and Charlie Mingus and Ornette Coleman, and on and on. But those were all Los Angeles players who, but had they stayed in Los Angeles,
we wouldn't know their names.
You wouldn't know their names.
Yeah.
That's right.
What drew you to jazz as a young man?
Well, it's, my mother was a part-time nightclub singer. She usually worked days and sang somewhere in San Diego at least a few nights a week. She always loved singing, and she was a good singer. And because of that, and also there was some other, didn't come from a musical family in the professional sense, but an uncle was a violinist, and we were certainly a music-oriented family, and there was some wonderful 78s that I always remember from my earliest childhood memories that we had in the home, of course, you know, before LPs even. Bix Beiderbecke we had, and Billie Holiday specifically. I think maybe also some Eddie Condon and some other great stuff, but I specifically remember the Bix Beiderbecke and Billie Holiday 78s, and my earliest memories of jazz are those records, which is not a bad introduction. Yeah. And you have to remember, too, how much more jazz there was, live jazz there was on the radio in those days. There again, that's virtually non-existent. Today we have one local jazz station at the community college here in San Diego that does have live broadcasts, I think once a month. But in most parts of the country, that's a thing of the past. But there was a lot of live music on the radio in those days, big bands and smaller groups, you know, from the Royal Roost in New York and all kinds of stuff that was on there. They call them remotes, you know. And so you could hear Charlie Parker on the radio, and I don't remember hearing Bird. I was still too young to have heard those broadcasts, really, or to have been aware of what was going on. But I remember vividly hearing Art Tatum on the radio, and Teddy Wilson. And those, along with some of the early records that I mentioned that we had in the home, I think were what they didn't. I was still too young to be thinking in terms of doing it, but at least it made that connection. The sound of that music seemed very special. Seemed very important compared to you know, the pop music of the day and whatnot. But actually, I became more interested in classical music as I got older, and I was really primarily interested in trying writing, you know, and
Composing
after
class.
composing,
Yeah.
after some of the people that I really admired at that time. They were still relatively modern composers,
Like,
Bartók and Stravinsky and Hindemith.
wow,
Well, you know, they're pretty traditional today by in a lot of people's.
not to my ears.
But they were still, that was pretty radical stuff.
Yeah.
You know, even in the 40s and early 50s. So, but I heard through a classmate, actually a guy, I played trombone in the school band at the high school here, Point Loma High School, and the trombonist I sat next to, another kid my age, we were probably in about the 10th grade, had bought an LP. By this time there were 10-inch LPs. And he said, you got to come over and hear this record I bought. And so I went by his house after school, and it was Jerry Mulligan's Tin Ted album, which is, I think, a classic recording. It was on, I think, Capitol Records, and this would have been about 1953 or 4, probably 54. And it had Chet Baker and Art Pepper and a great L.A. band, you know, and of course all of Jerry Mulligan's writing. And as I discovered a few years later, when I became a little more knowledgeable, it was really all pretty much out of the Gil Evans, Miles Davis collaboration records. You know, they were originally 45s, I think. But I wasn't aware of them yet, and to me, this was just breathtaking music, you know, which it still holds up really well, if you're familiar with that album. So anyway, the writing and the instrumentation, you know, Jerry was using French horn and tuba, and the colors, and just the swing, the time feel, the freedom in the soloing, the whole thing just, I always remember that day as the day that I went from being maybe mildly interested in the music to being absolutely absorbed with it.
Yeah, that's, I love to hear those little moments in a person's life that really make a difference, you know. And if you hadn't sat down to that, next to that fellow that day or whatever, if he hadn't bought that record, you know, things
Well,
might
he
have been
must have
different.
been hipper than I was, because he had the record, I didn't.
Did you
But
go get your
unfortunately-
own copy?
Oh, well, then shortly, you know, immediately I started grabbing everything I could. You know, there weren't, it's hard to imagine a time when, if there were maybe 3 or 4 new LPs a month in the stores, that was a pretty hot month, you know. Well, now you have that many an hour coming out. But
Isn't that curious? Because the market for jazz today, as we've talked about, that the club scene is very poor, and that jazz is not, you know, the overall popular music, yet there's so much product.
I know, I was talking with someone about that just the other day. There's more than ever, and yet, you know, the health of the music generally is not great. I mean, as far as the real world of working and playing and performing and so on. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
Right.
Someone said they thought it was economically it's a lot cheaper to produce than ever before, perhaps, with modern technology, and that might have some bearing on it. I know companies used to be a lot more careful about, I mean, they would really screen people before they'd even consider recording them. Had to be someone who'd really paid some dues, and then they might get a chance, a shot at a record contract, you know, at least one record,
Yeah.
you know. And I don't think that's as much the case today. I think there's a lot more kind of, you know, readiness to record people and take a loss if necessary, because I don't think it's maybe as expensive as it was to produce CDs. Now, I don't know, you'd have to talk to someone in the business to get the numbers, but that was one theory I heard.
Well, you can
recently.
pretty much go out and make your own these days for not that much money,
exactly.
too.
A lot of people do, you know.
Yeah.
They buy their own stampers and make, you know, literally you can produce CDs at home now, buy the
Right.
jewel boxes. So I don't know. But then shortly after that, then I discovered Monk and Miles and the people, the really historic people on the East Coast, you know, who had changed the face of the music. And I had seen Duke live here when I was still a kid. His band came to town. And I remember seeing Jazz at the Phil. They came through. So, you know, I'd had some good roots in that area. And there was actually a really thriving music scene in San Diego when I was growing up. I was fortunate because it was a Navy town and this was the war. San Diego was a jumping town between the service people that were stationed here and all of the people who came out here from all over the country to work in the plants, you know, the aircraft plants and defense. Nightclubs were booming then, and I mean like 7 nights a week and Sunday matinees, and there were great players here. Harold Land was here at one time, you know, and there's a wonderful alto player in New York I've never met, but he's from San Diego, named Arthur Blythe. He's a marvelous player. I really admire him a lot, and I think he used to work around here in R&B bands, you know, growing up in San Diego. So, and Walter Fuller was here, a trumpet player who'd been with Lionel Hampton's band, and there were a lot of wonderful players, and so it was a good environment to grow up in.
So from hearing these records and then deciding that this is something I want to try to do, how did you teach yourself how to play jazz?
Well, I pretty much did myself. I had a series of, I started early studying, which was fortunate, at about 7, but generally it was neighborhood piano teachers, which in those days there was a piano teacher in almost every block, you know. I mean, it was very common. Part-time piano teachers. There were pianos in most homes, or many homes anyway, and it was much more common to find pianos in someone's living room. And so I studied with a series of okay, you know, beginning teachers, but I've always regretted, I never had one that was really a real taskmaster, a real disciplinarian, because I really, later on, I had to go back and kind of reteach myself a lot of things, correct a lot of bad habits that I, you know, had gotten away with early. But at least I did have the advantage of having started early. But I really, as far as whatever technical facility I have, is pretty much self-taught. I made myself later try to learn how to do it right, or at least as best I could. But I did have one teacher, a man who was not particularly interested in teaching scales and Chopin etudes or anything of that nature, but he was a Teddy Wilson fan, and he played in that style, and played very well in that style, that great left-hand stride style and the wonderful time feel and all. And I finally got with him when I was about 12 or 13. His name was Bill Franks, and he's since deceased, but he taught here for many years. And he was marvelous in, each week we would take songs and just reharmonize them. And he was marvelous at allowing a student the freedom to try things. And he would be encouraging. He would never say, no, you can't do that because it's not right. There was no right or wrong. He would just say, well, that's interesting, and then maybe if you tried this, it might even be better. So that was a very positive input. But I used to take some really crazy ideas each week, a rethinking of Stardust or something that I'm sure he was probably, cringing some of the time at my attempts. But, it was a wonderful opportunity for a young player to learn through someone like that. So anyway, basically I am a self-taught player with a lot of help from this one particular teacher.
Yeah.
But
Hindemith plays Stardust, right?
Yeah. Well, of course, that was really before I was.
Yeah.
I was interested in classical music, but it was slightly later that I became really more interested in that aspect of music. But you know, today it's such a different situation with so much jazz education, and you know, the young players today, so many of the pianists I hear, I mean, they sound like conservatory trained players. I mean, as far as pure facility is concerned, wonderful, wonderful chops, and they've obviously had, at least they sound to me as though they've had very, very good, strong training. And that's another thing I try to encourage young players. I don't really teach, but if I do talk with a young player, I always try to stress, well, whatever style you want to play, whatever you want to do as far as jazz is concerned, get with a good classical teacher and learn how to really play the instrument. And they don't always want to hear that, but that's, and then go to New York.
They could say, yeah, well, watch Thelonious Monk.
Well, I
play.
know, sure, and it's hard to answer that.
Right.
But
they say, he's Monk and you're
yeah,
not.
yeah, exactly.
Right. What was the first important gig that you felt? I mean, if you look back on it now, was there
Well,
a series of gigs?
Probably, I worked at the Lighthouse, which was a famous club,
Yeah.
really an institution, in Hermosa Beach, which is just south of Los Angeles on the coast there. It was called the Lighthouse All-Stars, was the band. Howard Rumsey, who lives near here, by the way, now in Hemet, which is a city, it's about an hour and a half from San Diego. He had a wonderful band there, a house band there. I'm sure you're familiar with the Lighthouse. And I was fortunate enough to play in that band for a few months that would have been about 1962, I guess. Yeah. And before that, I had just played, around San Diego in clubs and with a lot of great players. A wonderful drummer named John Guerin. I don't know if you're familiar with his name. He's been in L.A. for years. He was from down here. We grew up together. And a trumpet player who died very young, unfortunately, named Don Sleet, who did some recording. Wonderful player. There were some marvelous young players down here. But the first job where I actually got out of San Diego and did something that, on the L.A. scene anyway, was with that band at the Lighthouse. And then shortly thereafter, I worked with Shorty Rogers and his Giants, which was a very well-known band in those days. And by that time, I was pretty much settled in L.A. and playing up there mostly.
Did the players, like Shorty Rogers and yourself, did you consider that you were playing the West Coast sound, or was that something that the East Coast people put on your music?
I never thought about it because really most of my heroes were players on the East Coast. But that, having said that, I mean, there were such great players out here. I almost hesitate to say, when I say most, I mean, maybe more back there than in L.A., but, Hampton Hawes was active and really playing at his peak, and Carl Perkins, another great pianist, who also died very young. Russ Freeman. I mean, there were wonderful, wonderful players out here. And as I alluded to earlier, had they gone back east and stayed back there, they would have reached a much higher level of recognition than they ever did. But they, for whatever reasons, they chose to stay out here. But, they were the first people I heard live just because of the proximity. I mean, I didn't go to the East Coast until the early 1970s. So there was a long period where the only people I worked with or saw live really were primarily people out here. I saw traveling bands, of course, that would come out from New York, but I remember seeing Miles out in L.A. the first time. But that whole East Coast, West Coast thing, by the 60s, I think it had somewhat subsided. That was more of a journalistic big deal in the 50s. And I think it sold a lot of records in both directions, and it created a kind of a stir. There's nothing like some kind of a
Yeah.
real or fictional rivalry to kind of whip things up and get a little more press maybe than. But it was very real. I mean, I remember the articles that would come out about East Coast and West Coast, and some albums would make some reference in their titles. East meets West, and you know, so it was definitely happening. But I think by the '60s that had kind of
Yeah.
worn itself out. There's no question that there are people. There's a New York attitude that, just as in the famous map, is it Steinberg, the artist, the New Yorker artist, who, that, in a nutshell, there's nothing west
Oh, he did
of
the thing with
Hudson. Yeah.
all New York, and
Yeah,
in
well,
the back
that's
there's this teeny little-
very very astute summing up of the New York attitude. I think about most everything in general, not just jazz music, but
Yeah.
and you know, when you leave New York, you're not going anywhere. Is kind of the attitude. So, you know, I think to that extent, I mean, it's certainly never out here. There was never any discrimination against the East. I mean, everybody out here genuinely admired everybody back there. And as I said earlier, a lot of people back there had been out here originally anyway. But there's a lot of it. I mean, you to this day in New York, you get a certain amount of that. You know.
Yeah.
That just kind of goes with the territory. And it never bothered me. I mean, I admired what was going on there so much and the players so much. I felt they were entitled to that, you know. I mean, they had earned it. If you've paid your dues there and over a period of time, you know, you can have whatever attitude you want as far as I'm concerned. Because it's tough there. I mean, it's tough. It's tough to survive. The weather's tough. So, you know, I admire those guys.
Right. How'd you've accompanied some great singers.
Yes, I've been very fortunate.
Yeah. Sarah Vaughan, for one. How did that come about?
I'm never really sure. I was with her 2 years, 2 separate years. I worked with her 12 months in '79, and then left and went back in '83 and worked another full year. So, but I think I probably initially got the job through Roy McCurdy, who was a good friend of mine, and we had played together a lot when he came off the road after he'd been with Cannon for so long. He settled in L.A. And Sarah had called him, I think, as I remember. She was putting together a new backup trio, and she had called Roy first, and I think Roy then had recommended me, and Andy Simpkins was the bass player. And so that was the trio for the first year, for the most part. Roy left at one point, and Grady Tate was with us for a while, and then Harold Jones finished that first year. So I played with several different drummers. Andy Simpkins stayed with her actually up until her death. Then I left to do some other things and went back in '83 when there was another opening with her. At that point, it was still Andy and Harold Jones still. So we had a good time. But, and Sarah was just fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Easy to work with.
The easiest singer I've ever worked with, of any I can think of. I mean, just absolutely professional. I never heard Sarah complain once about anything, unless it was a legitimate mess up. If a sound man or a lighting man or someone wasn't taking care of business and doing their job, she'd be all over them, and rightfully so. But I never ever heard her complain about not feeling good, having a cold, having a sore throat, having sinus problems. And there were a lot of times when I know she didn't feel good, you know, traveling as hard as we did, because we traveled just almost constantly. And it's pretty remarkable, because there are very few singers you can say that about. I mean, she was really unique.
Did she allow you, I don't know if allow is the right word, but when I assume that you did some experimenting with different chord changes and stuff from night to night, and did you ever play anything that would make her you know, kind of look at you like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that works.
Not with Sarah.
Uh-huh.
I have to qualify that a little bit. There was more freedom with her than with anyone I've ever worked with, including the biggest names down to the most kind of, you know, beginning singers that I worked with early on when I was first starting to accompany. She didn't need any help at all. She knew exactly what she was doing. The only place you could get in trouble is she would give you so much freedom that if you got carried away and got yourself out on a limb somewhere harmonically or whatever,
Yeah.
She would go with you. I mean, she heard everything. And she would go with you into these territories. Well, if you weren't prepared to follow through and didn't have a pretty good idea of where you wanted this to end up, you could feel pretty foolish. And then at that point, she might give you the ray, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't remember that happening more than maybe a couple of times in
Uh-huh.
the 2 years I was with her. Because you couldn't throw her. I mean, it's not like with so many pretty good singers where if you go too far, they're lost. You know, they're not going to be able to get it back together. That never happened with Sarah. She just she was too astute, and you know, she was an excellent pianist herself, a very good musician. She knew chords. She could sight read. You know, she was a musician, and so anyway, no, she was the easiest to accompany of anyone because there were no predetermined parameters or rules. The one thing she did do is repeat her sets a lot. We didn't change material very often. We would, sometimes for months at a time, we would perform pretty much the same show with maybe a few. It was, you know, she would give me the free rein to maybe juggle some things here and there, but for the most part, we didn't introduce a lot of new material all the time. So you have to keep it interesting for everybody, you have to try to find interesting little switches on things and a new take on something, you know. So that's a challenge when you're doing new material all the time. You don't maybe even have the time to think about that kind of stuff. But so it was great. Ella, who I worked with later, you know, what can you say about Ella? I mean, we all know how, you know, remarkable Ella Fitzgerald was. Ella was a different kind of singer. Ella was more specific in what she needed to hear behind her and wanted to hear. And and it was great too. It was just a different kind of thing. It was more tailoring what you do to make what she needed happen and work. Sarah was more of a bebopper, you know, in that sense. And of course, when you understand the history of, you know, her early years, it's understandable. I mean, you know, coming up with the people she did.
Right.
Yeah.
Was Ella's, I had read that she tended to be, even as great as she was, quite nervous about coming on stage. Is that true?
She was. She was. If Sarah was, she hit it very well. I was never, ever aware of any nervousness. Now, you never know for sure what's going on inside someone, but Ella was like, I think, many very accomplished actors and actresses and singers, you know, and even people who've done it for decades talk about how nervous they are before they go out. You know, a Laurence Olivier or someone talking about they still get butterflies, you know.
Yeah.
I believe, you know, when he was still alive, I think I remember hearing that comment in one interview from him, and you know, you can't imagine that this person would still get butterflies. But Ella did, but then the minute she hit the stage, which is often the case with performers, that was gone and she was fine. You know? I never sensed a moment's lack of self-assurance or any stage nerves once she hit the stage, but she'd be pacing around backstage before they announced her. You know? And that's really more typical, I think, than Sarah. Sarah was very unusual and not having that.
I see you were part of the All That Jazz Grammy Award winner. Did you get a Grammy for that?
No, it didn't. Actually, that was the first time I had worked with Ella. I got called to do that session. Actually, I think there were a total of 4 sessions. I did 2 of them. Kenny Barron did, I think I did 3 and Kenny did 1 or something like that. And for that CD, and then on the basis, I think as I realized later, I think Norman Granz had, he knew he was going to have to find someone for Ella because Paul Smith was leaving, the accompanist who had been with her. And I think he hired me to do the CD to see how we worked together. Because I did, prior to actually going into the studio, I did go to the house a couple of times, and we would Ella and I would work out some things, and keys and tempos and so on. And I think that was kind of Norman's way of seeing what the chemistry was like, and if I would be right, you know. And apparently on the basis of how things went, he and she felt comfortable. And not too long after we did the recordings for the CD, their office called me to see if I wanted to start doing the touring, which by that time was not that heavy. You know, Ella was going out, maybe just a few days a month. You know, we might be gone a total of a week out of a month, maybe. In her prime, earlier when she was, before she'd had some health problems, I think she was on the road about 50 weeks out of the year.
Yeah.
Like Sarah, that's how Sarah was. But she had to curtail some of that, and her doctors had forced her to. But we still, you know, we were out there quite a bit.
Has there been a time in your career where you've been tempted, either because financially or just because you were looking for something different, where you got into non-musical jobs?
Only in the beginning. About 1957 it would have been, when I was first married. I worked for about 6 months at an aircraft plant at Hughes Aircraft in Los Angeles as a draftsman, an industrial artist, which that isn't even done anymore. It's all graphic art now.
Right.
We used to actually use pencils and sit at drafting boards, if you could believe that.
Right.
And T-squares and all. But that was for about 6 months, and other than that, I have been just in the music business. Not always just jazz. I've done a lot of different kinds of work. You really have to survive if you're not going to teach or have some other means of support. You know. So I've done a lot of show work and strip joints and everything.
I was going to say, what was the job where you said, "Man, I can't believe I'm doing this"? Has there been?
Has there been one? Well, I never, from as early on as I can remember, before I was even in the union, just a kid playing in high school gyms and stuff, I never turned down work. I think I must have figured out very early on that you better not turn down work.
Yeah.
Because there may not be any next week. So, and still to this day, I find it very difficult to turn something down unless it's just absolutely not right. But, I mean, I've always been kind of a blue-collar musician. I mean, I work and I think really it's a detriment in some ways, because you dissipate your energies and your creativity to a certain extent by taking that approach to the business. I think a truer artistic approach where you only do, as guys I've known, who only do what they want to do, only do what they feel is pure and untainted and artistically correct. If you can survive doing that, I think it is better in a lot of ways, because I think you save your energies for that focus. If you're doing too many different kinds of things in this business, I think it's very hard to stay focused.
Yeah.
And so there is a downside to that work ethic, you know.
Well, I know what you're talking about.
You know what I mean exactly.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
and you can become, you can get a lot of calls, you know, to do lots of different kinds of things, and perhaps the thing that you were looking at to really excel at does suffer a bit. But as you said, there's a practical side to life that, you know, requires you to take those things because they're paying.
Well, if you're, you know, raising a family, and
Yeah.
here again, if you're single and are in a different situation, you have a lot more freedom to say no. You know,
Mhm.
but for various reasons, I just have always felt, hey, if the phone rings, might be foolish to turn it down. So I've done a lot of things. So anyway, in answer to your question, I've never felt like I was above doing a certain kind of job.
Mhm.
The only thing that's ever bummed me, like with all of us, I guess, is when it turns out that it's really bad. Just the playing is bad.
Yeah.
If it's a horrible singer you end up with for 4 hours accompanying, or just a band that's hopeless or whatever, then you're just waiting for it to be over, you know, and you're thinking maybe, why did I get into this? But, you know, that we all go through those experiences, and a lot of times coming up, I was lucky to be in even that good a band because I was still learning myself, and
Mhm.
as Art Tatum, I remember he said in an interview I heard a few years ago on the radio that he'd never heard a pianist he couldn't learn from, which is, you know, kind of the same thing. I mean, you're going to learn from even the worst situations.
You can learn what not to do.
What
also.
not to do, or what to avoid, or
Yeah.
how not to play, or
How not to act.
yeah. But I think Tatum, you know, really meant that when he said
Yeah.
it. So, but I've done a lot of different kinds of work, and then I ended up doing studio work in L.A. and Hollywood from about the late 60s to the late 70s, about a 10-year period.
Mhm.
And I didn't set out to do that. I don't think many guys in the studios, men or women, set out to become studio players. I mean, that's not like a lifelong dream as a kid
Yeah.
that you, it just happens. You know, if you're in a particular area like Los Angeles or New York where there's a lot of that work, and you happen to get a few of the calls, and if you're halfway good at it, word of mouth and referrals, you begin to get a few more calls.
Mhm.
So I ended up doing a lot of that, and it was a great experience, really, because, among other things, I had to really go back and woodshed the instrument.
Mhm.
Some of the stuff you're called upon to do in a motion picture score, for instance, really requires some pretty serious playing as far as sight reading and performance skills. And it forced me to kind of, again, to reevaluate my own playing. A lot of it was just craft. It wasn't high art, you know,
Yeah.
playing on a TV show score.
Uh-huh.
But within that context, you can still get a lot out of it. You know.
Do you ever hear anything on the television, reruns or whatever, and say, hey, I played on that?
You know, I hardly watch television,
Uh-huh.
so I don't. I'm sure there are. I still get checks, you know,
Yeah.
for stuff, a show that's playing in Finland that I did in 1967 or something, you know. But I don't watch enough TV to know. But I know, yeah, that there's some of them are still playing. I did a Rice-A-Roni commercial that was on for about 20 years.
Rice-A-Roni.
That's the
That's the
one.
one? What was your part in that? It just...
Yeah, it was actually a very good writer, a guy named Don Specht, who was a jazz Bud Powell
Yeah.
piano player. He could sit down and sound just like Bud Powell.
Wow.
But he, like a lot of guys, you know, he'd gotten into writing jingles, and he was good at it. And he always hired the hippest players. You know, he'd have Shelly Manne and Joe Pass or whoever. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
And doing these kind of idiotic little jingles, you know, but he'd try to make them as good as he could and have good players. So I don't know what, I haven't thought of that in years. Actually, I don't know that something triggered that, but I probably shouldn't even mention that.
No, those things are great, you know, and that's what people, I don't think, have a realistic picture of what jazz musicians or a lot of musicians, how they really make a living. You know, that playing with Ella and you know, the list of people you played with, the Zoot Sims and Sweets Edison, and those are great moments, and your recordings here, but that doesn't happen every single day.
No, those are the highlights and high points, but unless you maybe were touring for long periods, you know, with a Stan Getz, or like for instance, I worked with Stan in different venues, concert situations, but never to tour for like 6 months or whatever. So, yeah, you have to fill up the rest of your time with other stuff,
Right.
and so I've done a lot of stuff. You know, I said to somebody recently, I've done just about everything except maybe play in a circus band, because they didn't use keyboards then.
Right.
Now they do.
Yeah.
But you know, and a lot of it has just been kind of, I guess, daring or something. I never thought of it that way, but I used to, again, kind of in keeping with what we were talking about, I would, like with a lot of studio work, I would just say yes and hope that I could pull it off, and a lot of it was just on-the-job training. You know, if I'd had more sense, I guess I would have said, you know, I better pass on this. I don't think I can do it.
Yeah.
And you just get in there and you figure out how to do it, because you're expected to, and you're going to look pretty stupid if you can't. You know.
Well, you said a couple minutes ago, you said you were talking about the studio music, I think, and you said most of it was just craft.
Yeah.
And at first I thought you were going to say crap.
No, crap.
But I think it's a telling thing that you didn't say that, because even playing on a Rice-A-Roni commercial, you have to do what's required and not more, you know, because I've heard plenty of players who can play the piano like crazy, but they don't understand the gig. If it's
Well,
solo piano, if it's in a restaurant or something.
And that's where the professional, you know, again, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, there's craft and there's art, as far as I'm concerned. It's kind of like the old lines years ago. Someone said there's music and there's the music business. And they're very often two very different things. Yeah, you know, on any given day in a Hollywood studio, and it would be the same in New York, I was sitting with the greatest players in the world, you know, guys who could sit in a symphony orchestra, who could do all kinds of stuff. So there was nothing demeaning or ridiculous about being there. I mean, you were lucky to be there. But a lot of times the product you were going for was maybe, you know, we're not talking here, you know, Pierre Boulez. This is, but on the other hand, in many cases it was wonderful music. I mean, great writers, you know, who took it very seriously, and even if it was just a fairly innocuous film, took the writing very seriously. You know, I worked for Dave Grusin a lot. Dave Grusin wrote beautiful stuff for some comedy shows we used to do, and the string writing and everything would be absolutely gorgeous. Tom Scott and some of those people. So anyway, yeah, you know, studio work was just something that happened, and about that same time, jazz went into another one of its declines. You know, the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
It was a very difficult time for jazz. I mean, there have been all these valleys over there, and that was one of them. And at the time, it just seemed like, again, it was partly survival. You know, there's no point in starving. I mean, you just do what you have to do, you know. And if there'd been more interesting stuff going on to do, I would have tried to do that. But at that particular point in my life, it was good work, and I did learn a lot about it from as a player and even as a writer. So, and I sat with some really wonderful players.
You have a family, children?
Yeah, I have my wife and I combined. It's not our first marriage for either, and we have 6 children between us, and then
Yeah.
grandchildren. And
Wow.
so we have a pretty widespread family now.
Musicians in the family? Are there?
No, no. Actually, I have a grandson right now who seems to have probably some interest, you know,
Uh-huh.
but it's too soon to tell. But I never encouraged it. I knew how hard it was.
Yeah.
And I never pushed music. And I really think that if I'm sure the same would be true with acting, any of the arts, if a child is determined to do it, they'll do it no matter what you tell them. And if they don't have that determination, they probably shouldn't do it.
Mhm.
So there's really, you know, the whole subject of encouragement, I think, is a difficult one.
Right. Do you think they had a sense, your children, of what you did for a living? Did they understand it? Did they think it was a little out of the ordinary?
You know, that's an interesting question, Monk. I've never really thought of it that way. A couple of my older kids, when they were still little, actually I would take on, for instance, studio calls with me, just to see if they, you know, would find that interesting, and like, what'd you do at the office today, you know.
Yeah.
So, and they always seemed to enjoy it, that sort of thing. But generally, I'd say no. I think Dad just went off
Yeah.
to do what he does. You know, I'm not sure that.
Right. Kids take it in stride.
Yeah. You know.
You have a gig tonight. I remember my own little kids saying that at a very early age. So,
Yeah.
Dad, you got a gig tonight?
Yeah,
It was just, you were just going to work.
Sure. Yeah.
That's great. What's in the close future for you? More of the same?
Well, I still travel some.
Mhm.
I stay primarily in San Diego. I do some work in L.A. I just was up there earlier this week. I worked with Ray Brown on some recordings up there with a wonderful, it was the first time I'd worked with him. I'd admired him on recordings, but first time I'd met him or worked with him. Ralph Moore, wonderful tenor player, soprano player, marvelous, who is now in L.A. I didn't realize that. I thought he was still in New York, but he's, you know, so many guys have moved out here, and a drummer named Greg Hutchinson, who's a marvelous young drummer. And Ralph's out here to do the Tonight Show. He's part of the Tonight Show band, Jay Leno's show.
Oh.
So that's what he's doing out here. Well, so anyway, you know, I do get up there to do some things. But I've become more interested in kind of experimental music, and it's still jazz-oriented, but I've moved away from mainstream jazz as such, as far as my own projects.
I
I
see.
still do a certain amount of that when I'm called to do so, you know. But I have a group here in San Diego now called Live Music, which is an interesting combination of instrumentation. And,
Any electronic
some,
things involved?
it's primarily still acoustic,
Yeah.
but it's the violinist, who's also a guitarist, Art Johnson, a wonderful guitarist, who's in Los Angeles for years, uses electric violin at times, but it's primarily an acoustic group, acoustic bass and drums, and but cello and bass clarinet and various interesting combinations of instruments, and we're doing a lot more exploratory kind of improvisational music. It's really probably closer to the classical world than jazz as such, but although everyone is from the jazz world, all the players are. You know. So I'm more and more, as far as my own personal projects, I'm more interested in where do we go from here.
You
Not in
recall
the
a
past.
record by Roger Kellaway, the cello quartet?
Oh, certainly, yeah.
That was
yeah,
some nice
yeah.
stuff there.
I had,
yeah.
Roger had not been in L.A. very long. He had come out from New York when he did that, and he had only been in L.A. a year or two, I think, when I first met him out here. I'd been aware of him from an early recording he'd made in New York, but yeah, that's an interesting And John Guerin is the drummer I mentioned
Oh, yeah.
earlier. And Chuck DeMonico, the bass
Uh-huh.
player. But I, you know, again, for someone, I'm 60 years old, particularly for people my age, both the players and the audience, you know, usually I find in talking with them they have become pretty much stuck somewhere as far as what they consider good and bad, and what they want to hear,
Yeah.
what they don't want to hear, what's BS and what is.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to happen. I feel very strongly that that's not. I don't want that to be the way one ages. You know?
Uh-huh.
I think it's much more important to. I'm really fascinated with what young people are thinking and how they hear it and how they see it. And I think world music, for lack of a better category, is here definitely bigger than ever. I think Cuban music obviously is having a tremendous effect on what goes on here. I think in the next few years we're going to see more and more of that influence.
Uh-huh.
And so much of what goes on in the rock world and in the classical world is so interesting that it's a shame to miss it, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I love everything that I grew up with, and have so much admiration for all of that. But you know, I have the hardest time with people who say, "Well, I love Charlie Parker, but I don't understand what these kids are trying to do." And it's exactly what people said about Charlie Parker in
Uh-huh.
his day.
Yeah.
You know, it's like they can't see the irony that they are simply stuck the same way,
Uh-huh.
you know. And if Bird were alive, I would hope that he would be trying to understand what some kid was doing, you know.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, that's just a personal reflection on,
Well,
you know, and
it's-
looking back.
It's good insight, and I think a good
It's hard to stay
statement.
that way. As you get older, you inevitably start to shut down. It's just part of what happens, I think. But
Uh-huh.
I think you need to fight it as long as you can.
I have to remember that when I get home and my 15-year-old turns on her music. You know?
Yeah, I know. Well, you know, not all of it's great, but there's some interesting stuff going
Right.
on, and it's you know, if you want to call it the postmodern
Right.
turn of the century attitude or whatever, but it's.
It's pretty funny too, because something she's listening to now, a guy's playing an old Wurlitzer electronic piano.
I know, amazing, huh? And Farfisas.
Yeah. So, hey, the classics are always being.
Who'd have thought?
Yeah. Well, this is great. I'm pleased you were able to come and join us
my
today.
pleasure. I really enjoyed
And,
it. Yeah.
On
great
behalf
to
of
be
the
here.
college, I'd like to thank you, and I hope your experimental group flourishes.
I hope,
Maybe
you know,
record
talk about few venues.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the hardest part of that
Yeah.
kind of project is just finding outlets,
Little
you know.
art center somewhere is
Have
what
to
you hope for.
scrounge around, but they're there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Good luck to you.